So in this video, I'm going to talk through the London Riots. So it's a sociology video for students of sociology, GCSE and A-level, but it might be interesting to people who aren't sociology students and are just interested in the London Riots. I think the London Riots are a really interesting example for sociology students to know about, and as you are probably aware, you are rewarded by examiners for bringing in contemporary examples. And I think that the London Riots can be used in so many different ways if you're studying crime and if you're writing about crime and sociology, crime and deviance. You can bring it into lots of different perspectives, lots of different angles, lots of different ways that you can talk about it. So in this video, I'm going to talk through all the different ways that sociology can be used to explain the London Riots. So here is a word cloud that I made based on the Wikipedia page for the London Riots, and I'm just going to kind of quickly talk through what happened. If you don't know anything about the London Riots, I do recommend that you find out about the riots, and I'm going to link to a study at the end and in the description that that will be really useful for you. But there's lots and lots available online for you to read and to watch about the riots. So the riots were in August 2011. And the spark for the riots was the police shooting of Mark Duggan in Tottenham. And following the shooting of Mark Duggan, there was a peaceful protest outside Tottenham Police Station, which then escalated and turned into a violent protest and then a riot, and then that kind of escalated further into looting, and riots not just in London, in different parts of London, but around other parts of England as well. So as you can see here, lots of things were really talked about at the time. So social media, politicians, the policing, all of those kind of things came up. So what I'm going to do now is start talking through the different perspectives and sociological concepts that can help us further understand the riots, and then students can apply the riots when talking about these things. So to begin with, functionalist explanations. So Durkheim talks about value consensus and anomy, and I think it can be argued that the riots were an example of a breakdown of social order, a breakdown of the value consensus in a few parts of the country, a few parts of London, just for a few days, and there was a sense of anomy, a breakdown of social order. So you could definitely use that to, when you're talking about the riots. Also, following the riots, there was cleanup in different communities. So communities came together to clean up after the riots. And Durkheim talks about the idea that a function of crime is to bring people together. So I would argue that the London riots can be used to illustrate that idea too. Similarly, Merton talks about strain theory and people innovating to achieve the goals of society. And we see people in this image breaking into Foot Locker to get shoes and trainers. And this is a form of innovation. They haven't been able to achieve the goals of society through traditional means, so they've innovated, they've looted to get those same goals. Cohen talks about status frustration, and I think it can be argued that the riots perhaps gave people a sense of status, gave people a feeling of a way of kind of getting ahead, getting a slice of the pie for themselves, maybe just gaining some status amongst their peers by getting involved in this. Perhaps they didn't have status through unemployment or education, so they have got involved in this to gain some status. So then moving on to Marxist or left realist explanations. So in terms of Marxism, Bonger says that crime is caused by poverty. And if you look at the profile of the rioters, a lot of them were from working class backgrounds, so that certainly backs up what Bonger would argue. Box says that crime is socially constructed by the powerful. And when I teach this, I often show this news story here where there was a London rioter who had a 6 months prison sentence for stealing some bottled water. So compare that to prison sentences of, or the lack of prison sentences, I should say, of like MPs and the MPs' expenses scandal. And then you say, well, is the criminal justice system working in favour of everyone or working in favour of the ruling class, to back up kind of what Box is saying? So definitely the riots can be used to illustrate Marxist explanations. Left realists, Lee and Young, talk about relative deprivation, so the sense of feeling deprived only when you are aware of other people with more. And again, going back to that image of people breaking into the Foot Locker, that would certainly be the case, that it was the material goods that people were looting. Marginalization and subculture, linking to class-based explanations. People, rioters, a lot of them, unemployed, marginalized, maybe involved in kind of criminal subcultures and things like that. The new right, Charles Murray would not have much empathy, I think, for the rioters, and say they're part of the underclass, say they've been poorly socialized, say they're part of dependency culture because of too generous welfare. So the new right would kind of pin the blame on the individuals and call for kind of harsh sentences and things like that. Okay, moving on to interactionist. So obviously Becker's concept of labeling is useful here, and there's an Oxford University report which found that the majority of the rioters lived in areas where there was an existing tension with the police. So that does suggest that perhaps some prior labeling had gone on, that it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, perhaps. The rioters getting involved because they think, well, the police don't like us anyway, we don't like them, we might as well kind of break the law. In terms of the interactionist explanations and think about the media, you've got moral panics and Cohen's concept of moral panics, and there was definitely moral panic after the riots, about hoodies and kind of this idea of kind of feral youth. You could also link that, I haven't written that on there, but Forbert's study on hoodies as well, from just before the riots, a more recent study. Young deviancy amplification, so this idea that the media maybe made things worse. The media reporting of the riots meant more people got involved. This idea of deviancy amplification. Obviously, Young originally was talking about hippies in Notting Hill in the 1960s and 70s, but it can be applied to the rioters as well, I think. From a postmodern point of view, or what's sometimes called kind of cultural criminology, Ling's concept of edge work, I think, can be used here. That the rioters, got a thrill from it. It was exciting. And if you look at the footage of the rioters, if you go on YouTube and have a look at the footage, it really is the case that people did seem excited by what they were doing. They were getting a thrill of it. This supports Kat's idea of the seduction of crime, and Presty as well, the carnival of crime, that crime's a place to kind of forget about all your worries and just kind of let loose, have fun, this carnival of crime. Also, postmodern ideas about consumerism and technology, I think, can be used to illustrate or to explain the riots as well. If you look at the places that were looted, it was consumer items. That's what people were going after: phones, clothes, shoes, those things. And technology was used in the riots. BlackBerry at the time, Twitter, messaging services, those kind of things were used, and the media picked up on that. So I think postmodern ideas are useful here as well. I'm not going to go through all of these. We're talking about class, age, gender, and ethnicity. They're the last few that we're going to do. But in terms of class, functionalist, new right, Marxist, left realist, all of these are talking about, crime from a kind of through a class lens. And I think that the riots can be used to illustrate any of those. So if you've got a question on class and crime, I think you could definitely talk about the riots and then bring in any of those studies and concepts that I've talked about. In terms of age, most of the rioters were young, which links with the peak offending age for males and females. Maybe this is a case of, functionalists talk about youth being a period of testing the boundaries. Perhaps this supports that. You could talk about the riots as an example there. Also, linking to official statistics and the peak offending age for males and females being the period of youth. You could even talk about the riots if you had a question on official statistics, that's backed up by the profile of the rioters. In terms of gender-based explanations, well, most of the rioters were young men. So why was it that there were fewer young women involved, or fewer women involved? Is it to do with social control? So Smart talks about the reason for less criminal activity in females is because of social control through parents, through perhaps school, through the media, through society as a whole. This links with Heidenson's concept of double deviance, that when young women commit crime, it's seen as doubly deviant. They're breaking the law, so that's the first count of deviance, but they're also going against gender expectations, so that's double deviance. Perhaps that put off some young women from getting involved. And then the other side of the coin is, what about masculinity? Perhaps it was masculinity that was an underlying kind of driver of these young men getting involved. So Messerschmitt's concept of hegemonic masculinity, kind of macho, being tough, being aggressive, was this a way of young men showing off their masculinity, proving themselves to their peers? Similarly, Mackengale has the concept of the crisis of masculinity. So for working class young men, it kind of links a bit to status frustration. But perhaps because of the lack of working class jobs, traditional working class jobs that maybe gave young working class men a sense of kind of masculine pride, crime is the outlet. Crime is the way that young men can gain status or assert their masculinity to wider society. And I think the riots could be an example to use there. Finally, ethnicity. And obviously there's lots and lots to say on this. But here are just a few points. I've talked about labeling already, that perhaps it's to do with police targeting, police labeling, institutional racism, the Macpherson report, which maybe created this this labeling and self-fulfilling prophecy. Also, you can link that to canteen culture by Waddington, that the police are going after certain groups in society. It's the culture that they've developed. And then Gilroy talks about resistance. So perhaps for young black men who are involved in the rioting, it's to do with, as Gilroy puts it, and I think it's a really excellent phrase, the scars of imperialist violence and racism in wider society has led to resistance, which is why some young people got involved in the riots as a kind of as a backlash, as a reaction to what they faced. So I hope that's been really useful for you. I hope it's been useful just running through those. I've almost gone through the whole sociology A-level crime specification there, and I know I've gone quite quickly, but hopefully it's been useful just to illustrate how one example can be used in so many different ways. So if you're writing about crime in sociology, really think about bringing in the London riots as your contemporary example. There's lots and lots to say. If you want to read more about this, here's a free PDF, a free report on the riots called Reading the Riots by The Guardian and London School of Economics. And I'd really strongly recommend that you have a look at this. I'll link to it in the description. It goes into the profile of the rioters. It gives some excellent analysis of the riots. And I think if you're a sociology student, you really get a lot out of this. So let me know what you think. Hopefully this, as I say, this was useful. If you've got any questions, or if there's anything that didn't make sense, or perhaps you've got some ideas of other concepts, studies that could be brought in to illustrate or explain the riots, please leave a comment and I'll get back to you. Thanks so much.